Intensity by Dean Koontz. I've had this book for Intensity by Dean Koontz. I've had this book for a long time, and it's kind of falling apart at the edges, and the cover and the first 8 pages are missing, so I only have it from page 9. I'm a multi-channel warrior. Will they like me? Of course they'll like you. You know what I worry about? Laura asked as they raced toward the top of the incline. Apparently not death. You. I worry about you, Laura said. She glanced at China, and her expression was uncharacteristically serious. I can take care of myself, China assured her. I don't doubt that. I know you too well to doubt that, but life isn't just about taking care of yourself, keeping your head down, getting through. Laura Templeton, girl philosopher. Life is about living. Deep, China said sarcastically. Deeper than you think. The Mustang crested the long hill, and there were no burning buses or cheering multitudes, but ahead of them was an older model Buick, cruising well below the posted limit. Laura cut their speed by more than half, and they pulled behind the other car. Even in the fading light, China could see that the round-shouldered driver was a white-haired, elderly man. They were in a no-passing zone. The road rose and fell, turned left and right, rose again, and they could not see far ahead. Laura switched on the Mustang headlights, hoping to encourage the driver of the Buick either to increase his speed or to ease over where the shoulder widened to let them pass. Take your own advice, relax, kiddo, China said. Hate to be late for dinner. From everything you've said about her, I don't think your mom's the type to beat us with wire coat hangers. Mom's the best. So relax, China said. But she has this disappointed look she gives you that's worse than wire coat hangers. Most people don't know this, but Mom is the reason the Cold War ended. Several years ago, the Pentagon sent her off to Moscow so she could give the whole damn Politburo the look, and all those Soviet thugs just collapsed with remorse. Ahead of them, the old man in the Buick checked his rearview mirror. The white hair in the headlight beams, the angle of the man's head, and the mere suggestion of his eyes reflected in the mirror suddenly engendered in China a powerful sense of deja vu. For a moment, she didn't understand why a chill came over her, but then she was cast back in memory to an incident that she had long tried unsuccessfully to forget. Another twilight 19 years ago, the lonely Florida highway. Oh, Jesus, she said. Laura glanced at her. What's wrong? China closed her eyes. China, you're as white as a ghost. What is it? A long time ago, when I was just a little girl, 7 years old maybe, we were in the Everglades, maybe not. But the land was swampy like the glades. There weren't many trees, and the few you could see were hung with Spanish moss. Everything was flat as far as you could see. Lots of sky and flatness. The sunlight red and fading like now. A back road somewhere, far away from anything, very rural. 2 narrow lanes, so damn empty and lonely. China had been with her mother and Jim Woltz, the Key West drug dealer and gun runner, with whom they had lived now and then for a month or 2 at a time during her childhood. They had been on a business trip and had been returning to the Keys in Woltz's vintage red Cadillac, one of those models with massive tail fins and with what seemed to be 5 tons of chrome grill work. Woltz was driving fast on that straight highway, exceeding 100 miles an hour at times. They hadn't encountered another car for almost 15 minutes before they roared up behind the elderly couple in the tan Mercedes. The woman was driving. Bird-like, close-cropped silver hair, 75 if she was a day. She was doing 40 miles an hour. Woltz could have pulled around the Mercedes. They were in a passing zone, and no traffic was in sight for miles on that dead flat highway. But he was high on something, China told Laura, eyes still closed, watching the memory with growing dread as it played like a movie on a screen behind her eyes. He was most of the time high on something. Maybe it was cocaine that day. I don't know. Don't remember. He was drinking too. They were both drinking, him and my mother. They had a cooler full of ice, bottles of grapefruit juice and vodka. The old lady in the Mercedes was driving really slow, and that incensed Waltz. He wasn't rational. What did it matter to him? He could have pulled around her. But the sight of her driving so slow on the wide-open highway infuriated him. Drugs and booze, that's all, so irrational. When he was angry, red-faced, arteries throbbing in his neck, jaw muscles bulging, no one could get angry quite as totally as Jim Waltz. His rage excited my mother, always excited her. So she teased him, encouraged him. I was in the back seat, hanging on tight, pleading with her to stop, but she kept at him. For a while, Waltz had hung close behind the other car, blowing his horn at the elderly couple, trying to force them to go faster. A few times he had nudged the rear bumper of the Mercedes with the front bumper of the Cadillac, metal kissing metal with a squeal. Eventually, the old woman got rattled and began to swerve erratically, afraid to go faster with Waltz so close behind her, but too frightened of him to pull off the road and let him pass by. Of course, China said he wouldn't have gone past and left her alone. By then he was too psychotic. He would have stopped when she stopped. It still would have ended badly. Waltz had pulled alongside the Mercedes a few times, driving in the wrong lane, shouting and shaking his fist at the white-haired couple, who first tried to ignore him and then stared back wide-eyed and fearful. Each time, rather than drive by and leave them in his dust, he had dropped behind again to play tag with their rear bumper. To Waltz, in his drug fever and alcoholic haze, this harassment was deadly serious business with an importance and a meaning that could never be understood by anyone who was clean and sober. To China's mother Anne, it was all a game, an adventure, and it was she, in her ceaseless search for excitement, who said, "Why don't we give her a driving test?" Waltz said, "Test? I don't need to give the old bitch a test to see she can't drive for shit." This time, as Waltz pulled beside the Mercedes, matching speeds with it, Anne said, "See if she can keep it on the road, make it a challenge for her." To Laura, China recalled, there was a canal parallel to the road, one of those drainage channels you see along some Florida highways, not deep but deep enough. Waltz used the Cadillac to crowd the Mercedes onto the shoulder of the road. The woman should have crowded him back, forced him the other way. She should have tramped the pedal to the floor and pegged the speedometer and gotten the hell out of there. The Mercedes would have outrun the Cadillac, no problem. But she was old and scared, and she'd never encountered anyone like this. I think she was just disbelieving, so unable to understand the kind of people she was up against, unable to grasp how far they'd go, even though she and her husband had done nothing to them. Waltz forced her off the road. The Mercedes rolled into the canal. Waltz had stopped, shifted the Cadillac into reverse, and backed up to where the Mercedes was swiftly sinking. He and Anne had gotten out of the car to watch. China's mother had insisted that she watch too. "Come on, you little chicken. You don't want to miss this, baby. This is one to remember." The passenger side of the Mercedes was flat against the muddy bottom of the canal, and the driver's side was revealed to them as they stood on the embankment in the humid evening air. They were being bitten by hordes of mosquitoes, but were hardly aware of them, mesmerized by the sight below them, gazing through the driver's side window of the submerged vehicle. It was twilight, China told Laura, pointing towards the images behind her closed eyes. So the headlights were still on even after the Mercedes sank, and there were lights inside the car. They had air conditioning, so all the windows were closed, and neither the windshield nor the driver's side window had shattered when the car rolled. We could see inside because the windows were only a few inches underwater. There was no sign of the husband. Maybe he was knocked unconscious when they rolled, but the old woman, her face was at the window. The car was flooded, but there was a big bubble of air against the inside of the glass, and she pressed her face into it so she could breathe. We stood there looking down at her. Waltz could have helped, my mother could have helped, but they just watched. The old woman couldn't seem to get the window open, and the door must have been jammed, or maybe she was just too scared and too weak. China had tried to pull away, but her mother had held her, speaking urgently to her, the whispered words born on a tide of breath, sour with vodka and grapefruit juice. "We're different than other people, baby. No rules apply to us. You'll never understand what freedom really means if you don't watch this." China had closed her eyes, but she had still been able to hear the old woman screaming into the big air bubble inside the submerged car, muffled screaming. Gradually, the screaming faded, finally stopped, China told Laura. When I opened my eyes, twilight had gone and night had come. There was still light in the Mercedes, and the woman's face was still pressed to the glass. But a breeze had risen, rippling the water in the canal, and her features were a blur. I knew she was dead, she and her husband. I started to cry. Waltz didn't like that. He threatened to drag me into the canal, open a door in the Mercedes, and shove me inside with the dead people. My mother made me drink some grapefruit juice with vodka. I was only 7. The rest of the way back to Key West, I lay on the back seat, dizzy from the vodka, half drunk and a little sick, still crying, but quietly so I wouldn't make Waltz angry. Crying quietly until I fell asleep. In Laura's Mustang, the only sounds were the soft rumble of the engine and the singing of the tires on the blacktop. China finally opened her eyes and came back from the memory of Florida, from the long-ago humid twilight to the Napa Valley, where most of the red light had gone out of the sky, and darkness encroached on all sides. The old man in the Buick was no longer in front of them. They were not driving as fast as before, and evidently he had gotten far ahead of them. Laura said softly, "Dear God." China was shaking uncontrollably. She plucked a few Kleenex from the console box between the seats, blew her nose, and blotted her eyes. Over the past 2 years, she had shared part of her childhood with Laura, but every new revelation, and there was much still to reveal, was as difficult as the one before it. When she spoke of the past, she always burned with shame, as though she had been as guilty as her mother, as if every criminal act and spell of madness could be blamed on her, though she had been only a helpless child trapped in the insanity of others. "Will you ever see her again?" Laura asked. Recollection had left China half numb with horror. "I don't know. Would you want to?" China hesitated. Her hands were curled into fists. The damp Kleenex wadded in the right one. Maybe. For God's sake, why? To ask her why, to try to understand, to settle some things, but maybe not. Do you even know where she is? No, but it wouldn't surprise me if she was in jail. Or dead. You can't live like that and hope to grow old. They drove down, out of the foothills into the valley. Eventually, China said, "I can still see her standing in the steamy darkness of the banks of that canal, greasy with sweat, her hair hanging damp and all tangled, covered with mosquito bites, eyes blurry from vodka. Laura, even then, she was still the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. She was always so beautiful, so perfect on the outside, like someone out of a dream, so like an angel, but she was never half as beautiful as when she was excited, when there had been violence. I can see her standing there, only visible because of the greenish glow from the headlights of the Mercedes rising through the murky canal water. So ravishing in that green light, glorious, the most beautiful person you've ever seen, like a goddess from another world." Gradually, China's trembling subsided. The heat of shame faded from her face, but slowly. She was immeasurably grateful for Laura's concern and support. A friend. Unlike Laura, China had lived secretly with her past, unable to speak of it to anyone. Now, having unburdened herself of another hateful, corrupting memory, she couldn't begin to put her gratitude into words. "It's okay," Laura said, a look reading China's mind. They rode in silence. They were late for dinner. To China, the Templeton house looked inviting at first glimpse. Victorian, gabled, roomy, with deep porches front and rear. It stood a half-mile off the county road, at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by 120 acres of vineyards. For 3 generations, the Templetons had grown grapes, but they had never made wine. They were under contract to one of the finest vintners in the valley, and because they owned fertile land with the highest quality vines, they received an excellent price for their crop. Sarah Templeton appeared on the front porch when she heard the Mustang in the driveway, and she came quickly down the steps into the stone walkway to greet Laura and China. She was a lovely, girlishly slim woman in her earlier mid-40s, with stylishly short blonde hair, wearing tan jeans and a long-sleeved emerald green blouse with green embroidery on the collar, simultaneously chic and motherly. When Sarah hugged Laura and kissed her and held her with such evident and fierce love, China was struck by a pang of envy and by a shiver of misery at never having known a mother's love. She was surprised again when Sarah turned to her, embraced her, kissed her on the cheek, and still holding her close said, Laura tells me you're the sister she never had, so I want you to feel at home here, sweetheart. When you're here with us, this is your place as much as ours. China stood stiffly at first, so unfamiliar with the rituals of family affection that she didn't know quite how to respond. Then she returned the embrace awkwardly and murmured an inadequate thank you. Her throat was suddenly so tight that she was amazed to be able to speak at all. Putting her arms around both Laura and China, guiding them to the broad flight of porch steps, Sarah said, We'll get your luggage later. Dinner's ready now. Come along. Laura's told me so much about you, China. Well, Mom, said Laura, I didn't tell you about China being into voodoo. I sort of hid that part. She'll need to sacrifice a live chicken every night at midnight while she's staying with us. We only grow grapes. We don't have any chickens, dear, Sarah said. But after dinner we can drive to one of the farms in the area and buy a few. China laughed and looked at Laura as if to say, Where's the infamous look? Laura understood. In your honor, China, all wire coat hangers and equivalent devices have been put away. Whatever are you talking about? Sarah asked. You know me, Mom, my babbling ditz. Sometimes not even I know what I'm talking about. Paul Templeton, Laura's father, was in the big kitchen taking a potato and cheese casserole out of the oven. He was a neat, compact man, 5 feet 10, with thin dark hair and a ruddy complexion. He set the steaming dish aside, stripped off a pair of oven mitts, and greeted Laura as warmly as Sarah had done. After being introduced to China, he took one of her hands in both of his, which were rough and work-worn, and with faint solemnity, he said, We prayed you make the trip in one piece. Does my little girl still handle that Mustang as if she thinks it's the Batmobile? Hey, Dad, Laura said, I guess you've forgotten who taught me to drive. I was instructing you in the basic techniques, Paul said. I didn't expect you to acquire my style. Sarah said, I refused to think about Laura's driving. I'd just be worried sick all the time. Face it, Mom, there's an Indianapolis 500 gene on Dad's side of the family, and he passed it to me. She's an excellent driver, China said. I always feel safe with Laura. Laura grinned at her and gave a thumbs-up sign. Dinner was a long, leisurely affair because the Templetons liked to talk to one another, thrived on talking to one another. They were careful to include China and seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say, but even when the conversation wandered to family matters of which China had little knowledge, she somehow felt a part of it, as though she was, by a magical osmosis, actually being absorbed into the Templeton clan. Laura's 30th brother, Jack, and his wife, Nina, lived in the caretaker's bungalow elsewhere in the vineyard, but a previous obligation had prevented them from joining the family for dinner. China was assured that she would see them in the morning, and she felt no trepidation about meeting them, as she'd felt before she'd met Sarah and Paul. Throughout her troubled life, there had been no place where she had truly felt at home. While she might never feel entirely at home in this place either, at least she felt welcome here. After dinner, China and Laura went for a walk in the moonlit vineyards between the rows of low prune vines that had not yet begun to sprout either leafy trailers or fruit. The cool air was redolent with the pleasant, piquant smell of freshly plowed earth, and there was a sense of mystery in the dark fields that she found intriguing, enchanting, but at times disconcerting, as if they were among unseen presences, ancient spirits that were not all benign. When they had strolled deep into the vines and then turned back toward the house, China said, You're the best friend I've ever had. Me too, Laura said. More than that, China's voice trailed away. She had been about to say, You're the only friend I've ever had, but that made her seem so lame, and besides, was still an inadequate expression of what she felt for this girl. They were indeed, in one sense, sisters. Laura linked arms with her and merely said, I know. When you have babies, I want them to call me Aunt China. Listen, Shepherd, don't you think I should find a guy and get married before I start pumping out the babies? Whoever he is, he better be the best husband in the world to you, or I promise I'll cut his cojones off. Do me a favor, okay? Laura said, don't tell him about this promise until after the wedding. Some guys might be put off by it. From elsewhere in the vineyards came a disquieting sound that stopped China, a protracted creaking. It's just the breeze working at a loose barn door. Rusty hinges, Laura said. It sounded as if someone were opening a giant door in the wall of night itself and stepping in from another world. Jenny Shepherd could not sleep comfortably in strange houses. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, her mother had dragged her from one end of the country to the other, staying nowhere longer than a month or two. So many terrible things had happened to them in so many places that China eventually learned to view each new house, not as a new beginning, not with hope for stability and happiness, but with suspicion and quiet dread. Now she was long rid of her troubled mother and free to stay only where she wished. These days her life was almost as stable as that of a cloistered nun, as meticulously planned as any bomb squad's procedures for disarming an explosive device, and without any of the turmoil in which her mother had thrived. Nevertheless, this first night in the Templetons' house, China was reluctant to undress and go to bed. She sat in the darkness in a medallion-back armchair at one of the two windows in the guest room, gazing out at the moonlit vineyards, fields, and hills of the Napa Valley. Laura was in another room at the far end of the second-floor hall, no doubt sound asleep, at peace because this house was not at all strange to her. From the guest room window, the early spring vineyards were barely visible, vague geometric patterns. Beyond the cultivated rows were gentle hills, mantled in long dry grass, silver in the moonlight. An inconstant breeze stirred through the valley, and sometimes the wild grass seemed to roll like ocean waves across the slopes, softly aglimmer with lambent lunar light. Above the hills was the Coast Range, and above those peaks were cascades of stars and a full white moon. Storm clouds coming across the mountains from the northwest would soon darken the night, turning the silver hills first to pewter and then to blackest iron. When she heard the first scream, China was gazing at the stars, drawn by their cold light, as she had been since childhood, fascinated by the thought of distant worlds that might be barren and clean, free of pestilence. At first, the muffled cry seemed to be only a memory, a fragment of a shrill argument from another strange house in the past, echoing across time. Often as a child, eager to hide from her mother and her mother's friends when they were drunk or high, she climbed onto porch roofs or into backyard trees, slipped through windows onto fire escapes, away to secret places far from the fray, where she could study the stars, and where voices raised in argument or sexual excitement or shrill drug-induced giddiness came to her as though from out of a radio, from faraway places and people who had no connection whatsoever with her life. The second cry, though also brief and only slightly louder than the first, was indisputably of the moment, not a memory, and China sat forward on her chair, tense, head cocked, listening. She wanted to believe that the voice had come from outside, so she continued to stare into the night, surveying the vineyards and the hills beyond. Breeze-driven waves swelled through the dry grass on the moon-washed slopes, a water mirage like the ghost tides of an ancient sea. From elsewhere in the large house came a soft thump, as though a heavy object had fallen to a carpeted floor. China immediately rose from the chair and stood utterly still, expectant. Trouble often followed voices raised in one kind of passion or another. Sometimes, however, the worst offenses were preceded by calculated silences and stealth. She had difficulty reconciling the idea of domestic violence with Paul and Sarah Templeton, who had seemed kind and loving toward each other as toward their daughter. Nevertheless, appearances and realities were seldom the same, and the human talent for deception was far greater than that of the chameleon, the mockingbird, or the praying mantis, which masked its ferocious cannibalism with a serene and devout posture. Following the stifled cries and the soft thump, silence sifted down like a snowfall. The hush was eerily deep, as unnatural as that in which the deaf lived. This was the stillness before the pounce, the quietude of the coiled snake. In another part of the house, someone was standing as motionless as she herself was standing, as alert as she was, intently listening. Someone dangerous. She could sense a predatory presence, a subtle new pressure in the air, not dissimilar to that preceding a violent thunderstorm. On one level, 6 years of psychology classes caused her to question her immediate fearful interpretation of those night sounds, which conceivably could be insignificant after all. Any well-trained psychoanalyst would have a wealth of labels to pen on someone who will leap first to a negative conclusion, who lived in expectation of sudden violence. but she had to trust her instinct. It had been honed by many years of hard experience. Intuitively certain that safety lay in movement, she stepped quietly away from the chair at the window toward the hall door. In spite of the moon glow, her eyes had adjusted to darkness during the 2 hours that she had sat in the lightless room, and now she eased through the gloom with no fear of blundering into furniture. She was only halfway to the door when she heard approaching footsteps in the second-floor hall. The heavy, urgent tread was alien to this house. Unhampered by the interminable second-guessing that accompanied an education in psychology, reverting to the intuition and defenses of childhood, China quickly retreated to the bed. She dropped to her knees. Farther along the hall, the footsteps stopped. A door opened. She was aware of the absurdity of attributing rage to the mere opening of a door. The rattle of the knob being turned, the rasp of the unsecured latch, the spike-sharp squeak of an unoiled hinge. They were only sounds, neither meek nor furious, guilty nor innocent, and could have been made as easily by a priest as by a burglar. Yet she knew their rage was at work in the night. Flat on her stomach, she wriggled under the bed, feet toward the headboard. It was a graceful piece of furniture with sturdy gab legs, and fortunately, it didn't sit as close to the floor as did most beds. 1 inch less of clearance would have prevented her from hiding under it. Footsteps sounded in the hall again. Another door opened, the guest room door, directly opposite the foot of the bed. Someone switched on the lights. China lay with her head turned to one side, her right ear pressed to the carpet. Staring out from under the footboard, she could see a man's black boots and the legs of his blue jeans below mid-calf. He stood just inside the threshold, evidently surveying the room. He would see a bed still neatly made at 1 o'clock in the morning, with 4 decorative needlepoint pillows arranged against the headboard. She had left nothing on the nightstands, no clothes tossed on chairs. The paperback novel that she had brought with her for bedtime reading was in a bureau drawer. She preferred spaces that were clean and uncluttered to the point of monastic sterility. Her preference might now save her life. Again, a faint doubt, the acquired propensity for self-analysis that plagued all psychology students, flickered through her. If the man in the doorway was someone with the right to be in the house, Paul Templeton or Laura's brother Jack, who lived with his wife in the vineyard manager's bungalow elsewhere on the property, and if some crisis was unfolding that explained why he had burst into her room without knocking, she was going to appear to be a prime fool, if not a hysteric, when she crawled out from under the bed. Then, directly in front of the black boots, a fat red droplet, another and a third, fell to the weak old carpet. Plop, 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 blood. The first 2 soaked into the thick nylon pile. The third held its surface tension, shimmering like a ruby. China knew the blood wasn't that of the intruder. She tried not to think about the sharp instrument from which it might have fallen. He moved off to her right, deeper into the room, and she rolled her eyes to follow him. The bed had carved side rails into which the spread was tightly tucked. No overhanging fabric obstructed her view of his boots. Aversely, without a spread draped to the floor, the space under the bed was more visible to him. From certain angles, he might even be able to look down and see a swatch of her blue jeans, the toe of one of her Rockports, the cranberry red sleeve of her cotton sweater where it stretched over her bent elbow. She was thankful that the bed was queen-sized, offering more cover than a single or a double. If he was breathing hard, either with excitement or with the rage that she had sensed in his approach, China couldn't hear him. With one ear pressed tightly to the plush carpet, she was half deaf. Wood slats and box springs weighed on her back, and her chest barely had room to expand to accommodate her own shallow, cautious, open-mouthed inhalations. The hammering of her compressed heart against her breastbone echoed tympanically within her, and it seemed to fill the claustrophobic confines of her hiding space to such an extent that the intruder was certain to hear. He went to the bathroom, pushed open the door, and flicked on the lights. She had put away all her toiletries in the medicine cabinet, even her toothbrush. Nothing lay out that might alert him to her presence. But was the sink dry? On retiring to her room at 11 o'clock, she had used the toilet and then had washed her hands. That was 2 hours ago. Any residual water in the bowl surely would have drained away or evaporated. Lemon-scented liquid soap in a pump dispenser was provided at the sink. Fortunately, there was no damp bar of soap to betray her. She worried about the hand towel. She doubted that it could still be damp 2 hours after the little use she had made of it. Nonetheless, in spite of a propensity for neatness and order, she might have left it hanging ever so slightly askew, or with one telltale wrinkle. He seemed to stand on the bathroom threshold for an eternity. Then he switched off the fluorescent light and returned to the bedroom. Occasionally, as a little girl, and then not so little, China had taken refuge under beds. Sometimes they looked for her there. Sometimes, though it was the most obvious of all hidey holes, they never thought to look. Of those who found her, a few had checked under the bed first, but most had left it for last. Another red droplet fell to the carpet, as though the beast might be shedding slow tears of blood. He moved toward the closet door. China had to turn her head slightly, straining her neck to keep track of him. The closet was deep, a walk-in with the chain pull light in the center. She heard the distinctive snap of the tug switch, then the clinking of the metal beads in the chain as they rattled against the light bulb. The Templetons stored their own luggage at the back of that closet. Stacked with the other suitcases, China's single bag and train case were not obviously those of a guest in residence. She had brought several changes of clothes, 2 dresses, 2 skirts, another pair of jeans, a pair of chinos, a leather jacket. Because China was the same size as Laura, the intruder might conclude that the few garments on the rod were just spillovers from the packed closet in Laura's room rather than evidence of a house guest. If he had been in Laura's bedroom, however, and had seen the condition of her closet, then what had happened to Laura? She must not think about that, not now, not yet. For the moment, she needed to focus all her thoughts, all her wits on staying alive. 18 years ago, on the night of her 8th birthday, in a seaside cottage on Key West, China had squirmed under her bed to hide from Jim Woltz, her mother's friend. A storm had been raging from the Gulf of Mexico, and the sky-blistering lightning had made her fearful of escaping to the sanctuary of the beach where she'd retreated on other nights. After committing herself to the cramped space under that iron bed, which had been lower slung than this one, she had discovered that she was sharing it with a palmetto beetle. Palmettos were not as exotic or as pretty as their name. In fact, they were nothing more than enormous tropical cockroaches. This one had been as large as her little girl hand. Ordinarily, the hateful bug would have scurried away from her, but it had seemed less alarmed by her than by the thundering Woltz, who had crashed around her small room in a drunken fury, rebounding tirelessly from the furniture and the walls like an enraged animal throwing itself against the bars of its cage. China had been barefoot, dressed in blue shorts and a white tube top, and the palmetto beetle had raced in a frenzy over all that exposed skin, between her toes, up and down her legs, and up again, across her back, along her neck, into her hair, over her shoulder, the length of her slender arm. She hadn't dared to squeal in revulsion, afraid of drawing Woltz's attention. He had been wild that night, like a monster from a dream, and she had been convinced that, like all monsters, he possessed supernaturally keen sight and hearing, the better to hunt children. She hadn't even found the courage to strike out at the beetle or knock it away, for fear that Woltz would hear the smallest sound, even over the shriek of a storm and the incessant crashing of thunder. She had endured the palmetto's attentions in order to avoid those of Woltz, clenching her teeth to bite off a scream, praying desperately for God to save her, then praying harder for God to take her, praying for an end to the torment, even if by a bolt of lightning, an end to the torment, an end, dear God, an end. Now, although she wasn't sharing the space under this scalpy leg bed with any cockroach, China could feel one crawling over her toes as if she were that barefoot girl again, scurrying up her legs as if she were wearing not jeans but cotton shorts. She had never again worn her hair long since the night of her 8th birthday, when the bug had burrowed through her tresses, but now she felt the ghost of that palmetto in her closely cropped hair. The man in the closet, perhaps capable of atrocities infinitely worse than the wickedest dreams of Woltz, tugged on the chain pull. The light went out with a click, followed by a tinkle of metal beads. The booted feet reappeared and approached the bed. A fresh tear of blood glistened on the curve of black leather. He was going to drop to one knee beside the bed. Dear God, he'll find me cowering like a child, choking in my own stifled scream. In a cold sweat, all dignity lost in the desperate struggle to stay alive, untouched and alive, untouched and alive. She had the crazy feeling that when he peered under the side rail, face to face with her, he would be not a man, but an enormous palmetto with multifaceted black eyes. She had been reduced to the helplessness of childhood, to the primal fear that she had hoped never to know again. He had stolen from her the self-respect that she had earned from years of endurance, that she had earned, goddamn him. And the injustice of it filled her eyes with bitter tears. But then his blue boots turned away from her and kept moving. He walked past the bed to the open door. Whatever he thought about the clothes hanging in the closet, apparently he had not inferred from them that the guest room was occupied. She blinked furiously, clearing her tear-blurred vision. He stopped and turned, evidently studying the bedroom one last time. Lest he hear her child's shallow exhalations, China held her breath. She was glad that she wore no perfume. She was certain that he would have smelled her. He switched off the light, stepped into the hall, and pulled the door shut as he went. His footsteps moved off the way he had come, for her room was the last on the second floor. His tread swiftly faded, cloaked by the fierce pounding of her heart. Her first inclination was to remain in that narrow haven between the carpet and the box springs, wait until daybreak or even longer. Wait until there came a long silence that ceased to seem like the stillness of a crouched predator. But she didn't know what had happened to Laura, Paul, or Sarah. Any of them, all of them, might be alive, grievously wounded but drawing breath. The intruder might even be keeping them alive to torture them at his leisure. Any newspaper regularly reported stories of cruelty no worse than the possible scenarios that now unreeled vividly in her mind. And if any of the Templetons still lived, China might be their only hope of survival. She had crawled out of all the many hideaways of her childhood with less fear than she felt when she hesitantly slid out from under this bed. Of course, she had more to lose now than before she had walked out on her mother 10 years ago, a decent life built on a decade of ceaseless struggle and hard-won self-respect. It seemed madness to take this risk when safety was assured simply by her staying put. But personal safety at the expense of others was cowardice, and cowardice was a right only of small children who lacked the strength and experience to defend themselves. She couldn't simply retreat into the defensive detachment of her childhood. Doing so would mean the end of all self-respect, slow-motion suicide. It's not possible to retreat into a bottomless pit. One can only plunge. In the open once more, she rose into a crouch beside the bed. For a while, that was as far as she got. She was frozen by the expectation that the door would crash open and that the intruder would burst in again. The house was as echo-free as any airless moon. China rose to her feet and silently crossed the dark guest room. Unable to see the trio of blood drops, she tried to step around the place where they had fallen earlier. She pressed her left ear to the crack between the door and the jamb, listening for movement or breathing in the hall. She heard nothing, yet she remained suspicious. He could be on the other side of the door, smiling, deeply amused to think that she was listening, biding his time, patient because he knew that eventually she would open the door and step into his arms. Screw it. She put her hand on the knob, turned it cautiously, and winced as the spring latch scraped softly out of its notch. At least the hinges were lubricated and silent. Even in the inkiness to which her vision had not totally readapted, she could see that no one was waiting for her. She stepped out of her room and soundlessly pulled the door shut. By Dean Koontz, the first excerpt